They simply got the results, the numerical results, and crossed the ones out that they didn't want and put in new numbers. It was fraud upon fraud upon fraud, just as the movie says. The studies were meant to be done in a blinded fashion, so nobody knew what the samples were in advance, so they couldn't cheat. They were completely unblinded, so they did cheat and they knew which samples to change.
In today's interview, I am featuring Dr. Andrew Wakefield, a controversial gastroenterologist labeled as anti-vaccine after his research was misinterpreted. In the late 1990s, he investigated gastrointestinal issues following the MMR vaccine rollout and found that the vaccine strain of the measles virus was embedded in the gut lining of vaccinated children. The issue was highlighted in a 2021 case where a 17-year-old died from vaccine-associated measles after the presence of a vaccine strain of measles was confirmed by sequence analysis and genotyping. Dr. Wakefield joins me now to discuss his latest film, Protocol 7. You can learn more, watch it, and find the documents we discuss at Protocol 7, that's the number 7.movie. Protocol 7 exposes fraudulent efficacy claims by biopharmaceutical company Merck regarding the mumps component of their MMR vaccine. That's a combination vaccine of 3 live weakened strains of measles, mumps, and rubella, and the False Claims Act lawsuit that came as a result. Whistleblowers allege that Merck hid the declining efficacy of the shot, leaving government health programs blindsided by the faulty product. Wakefield explains.
Well, this is based on a true story, and in the sort of genre of all classic whistleblower stories, it's very much in the public interest. And I came across this story when I met the whistleblower many years ago, and I wrote the screenplay. I thought this will make an extraordinary story. It needs to be told. And I thought, but I'll let the court case play out because it is currently in court. Very unusual for the situation. We're right in the heat of a legal battle. And it went on and it went on and it went on. And children were still getting this defective vaccine, the Merck's mumps vaccine, and potentially being hurt by it because it wasn't working and they were susceptible to mumps. And so I decided after a while, we've just got to get on and make this. And so that was it. In the midst of the litigation, we went ahead and made this movie. And then the documents emerged from the court case, and we were confronted with, are these going to undermine what we've said in the story? In fact, they show that Merck's behavior was much worse than we even characterized in this story. So they got off lightly, if anything, and it was still extremely serious.
Leaning into the seriousness of the case, a big part of the fraudulent activity committed by Merck was their use of rabbit's blood to skew immunity results. Listen to this.
Yeah, the first thing they did was they wanted to see how effective immunity was against the wild type, the natural mumps virus. And when they tested that in the laboratory, the vaccine didn't work. So they thought, okay, let's substitute it with the weakened vaccine strain virus, even though they weren't allowed to do that. The FDA didn't want them to do that because we don't care about that as a parent. You want to know your child's protected against the natural mumps disease, not the weakened vaccine virus. That still didn't work. So then they had to go to another level of, I would describe as cheating, and that is to add rabbit's blood. Now, what did they do? They injected rabbits with human blood. The rabbits developed antibodies to human blood, turned the rabbit's blood into glue effectively. They then took the rabbit's blood and put it into the test, and it produced this entirely non-specific binding that gave them a false result, gave them a result that provided them, they hoped, with what they wanted, albeit it had nothing to do with immunity in children. And even that didn't work. And when that didn't work, they simply got the results, the numerical results, and crossed the ones out that they didn't want and put in new numbers. It was fraud upon fraud upon fraud, just as the movie says. The studies were meant to be done in a blinded fashion, so nobody knew what the samples were in advance, so they couldn't cheat. They were completely unblinded, so they did cheat and they knew which samples to change. And when it became such a mundane exercise that changing these, identifying the ones they had to change, they developed a software spreadsheet that highlighted the results they didn't want and allowed them to target those specifically. I mean, it was an extraordinary series of fraudulent steps that ultimately didn't give them what they wanted and we're still left with a useless vaccine.
Faced with an ineffective vaccine and fraudulent claims by Merck, the lawsuit determined that the CDC had no other option but to continue purchasing this vaccine since they had monopolized the market.
The court case was very, very successful in establishing that Merck did commit fraud. In fact, Merck didn't go to any length at all, effectively, to deny they committed fraud. What they said to the judge is it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because the CDC went on purchasing the vaccine. Therefore, the fraud was not material. And the CDC said, hang on a minute, if we'd known about this fraud, if we'd known what you'd done, we wouldn't have purchased the vaccine. And we needed to continue to protect children from measles and rubella. You've only given us one option, and that's the triple MMR, so we can't suddenly stop purchasing your vaccine. What they did do is open it up to another competitor, GlaxoSmithKline, to bring their MMR into America. So it removed Merck's monopoly, something they were very, very keen to protect. So that went to the appeal court in Philadelphia just 2 days ago, and hopefully in the appeals court, they're going to throw that decision out. They're going to say the lower court was wrong, it was material, the CDC as a purchaser did not know that they were being defrauded, and Merck will need to go to trial, to a jury trial.
But what effect did this ineffective and arguably unsafe vaccine have on the children whose parents thought they were protecting them from certain childhood illness?
It's a very good question, because in the court hearing that we've just been at in Philadelphia, the judge said, let me get this clear, this is not a matter of safety. Yes, it absolutely is. Why? Because mumps in an infant is trivial. Mumps in a post-pubertal adult is not trivial and can cause testicular inflammation, infertility, ovarian inflammation, brain inflammation. And so if you have a vaccine that doesn't work, that you receive as a child, and it stops working or never worked, by the time you're susceptible after puberty, you're at risk of a much more serious disease. And that is exactly what has happened. So we've seen mumps outbreaks across the world in highly vaccinated populations, people who've had 2 or 3 doses of the vaccine, precisely because this vaccine does not work in the way that we are told it works, or indeed was in the product license that enabled Merck to put the vaccine on the market. It started when Merck recognized in the late 1990s that their vaccine wasn't working. At that stage, the vaccine should have been withdrawn. They should have stopped producing it. There should have been a product recall. People who've been exposed to this vaccine should have been told. The CDC should have stopped buying it. None of that happened. The fraud continued through the early years of the 2000s until the whistleblower said, I'm going to report you to the FDA. Ultimately, it came to trial 12 years ago. The original filing was 12 years ago. Throughout that entire period, the same vaccine has been used. Merck have been profiting off it. The government have not told the public, not informed the public of what Merck did. And so the people who are really defrauded, that is the children, their parents, and the doctors who are giving them these vaccines, because they didn't know, they are the victims, and yet they have no representation in this case whatsoever.
And what about GlaxoSmithKline? Do they have the same issues as Merck?
Yes, they do. GlaxoSmithKline is a very interesting story that ties in with Canada, that Canada and the UK had the same mumps strain which caused meningitis. And in Canada, in Ontario, in fact, that was recognized and the vaccine was withdrawn very quickly. And they went to purchasing the Merck vaccine. In England, they knew of the data from Canada, and yet the same month that it was withdrawn in Ontario, it was introduced in the UK. It was known that it caused meningitis. 4 years later, they had to do an urgent study which demonstrated the high rate of meningitis compared with other vaccines, and that vaccine had to be withdrawn overnight. And so now, or at least until very recently, the only option was the failed Merck vaccine.
This is simply a microcosm of the larger playbook of Big Pharma and the sneaky business conducted to get their products sold.
Yeah, pharma are a disgrace. They are across the board. This is pharma's behaviour. It's not that this is an isolated event. We're now seeing Pfizer being sued in the US for withholding data on the very serious outcomes from exposure to their COVID shot. That it's not even a vaccine. It doesn't protect. It doesn't prevent transmission. It's now been deemed it's not even a vaccine. And they hid, apparently are alleged to have hidden, the fact that it caused myocarditis, pericarditis, heart inflammation, loss of pregnancy and death. And this is extremely serious. This is a systematic behavior by these companies. They are serial convicted felons. They are an international crime consortium, and our governments are doing business with them. It's absolutely extraordinary. If there were any other situation like that, we would have stopped doing business a long time ago. But because they are so hell-bent on vaccinating the entire population of the world with every vaccine, and given the power, the extraordinary financial power of the industry, then it's an uphill battle to get justice in any form, or proper regulatory behaviour in any form. Ultimately, I think there are two things that have happened. Film has made a big impact on people's perception, and people are saying no as a consequence. COVID made a huge impact, and I think COVID will turn out to be the biggest mistake they ever made, both in terms of their synthesis of a artificial, highly dangerous virus potentially, and then their intercession with the vaccines. I think that what needs to happen is people need to use their vote, use their power, say no, we're simply not doing it anymore. It's clear that the governments of the world, the CDC and others, are not going to do the science. They refuse to do the science because they don't want to do anything that might cast doubt upon the safety of vaccines, or indeed public trust in them, the vaccine policymakers. That's what it comes down to. So I think it's going to come down to people just simply saying, we don't trust you, you've lied to us, we're not doing it anymore.
Now, it wouldn't be an interview with Dr. Wakefield if we didn't touch on autism, which he says is the real pandemic.
If you look at the rate of autism in California now, from the time when I was a medical student, 1 in 10,000, it's now approached 1 in 22 children. 1 in 22 children. That is 1 in 14 boys. That is the true pandemic. That is what we should be worried about. Mortality from measles infection, measles disease, was declining precipitously from the 1920s onwards. It was approaching zero without any intervention, without any vaccines, without any antibiotics for secondary bacterial infections. That's what was happening. That was herd immunity. If we'd left alone and done nothing, that would have decayed to effectively 0 deaths from that disease. There would have been real herd immunity. But they didn't want to do that. Why? Because there was profit to be made. And they had this, the perceived success of polio vaccine led them down this road that we should have a vaccine for every disease, irrespective of how serious it is, and every child should get it. And that, rather like the history of antibiotics, where we've gone in less than 100 years from the miracle of antibiotics to the post-antibiotic apocalypse. This is how public health describe it, not me. The post-antibiotic apocalypse of multi-resistant, highly dangerous organisms generated specifically and because of the overuse of antibiotics. We're seeing a similar situation now with vaccines, and in 10 years' time, this landscape will look very different.
All in all, Dr. Wakefield stresses the importance of trusting maternal instinct, stating that no one knows their child better than their mother. This ineffective vaccine left children more vulnerable to serious forms of infection. It shows that the public should be best served to remain vigilant and aware of the deceptive practices of Big Pharma and to approach their products with a healthy dose of skepticism. For Rebel News, I'm Tamara Ugolini. We've launched a campaign at nomoreshots.ca where we're calling on Federal Minister of Health Mark Holland to revoke market authorization for the novel COVID-19 mRNA shots. You can learn more, sign our petition, and support our work at nomoreshots.ca.